So yeah, thank you for joining us this evening. I'm so pleased to be here with all of you for this special discussion of Darryl's latest book, A Great and Restless Spirit. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, which we're currently on in Meanjin, Brisbane, which is the Yagara and Turrbal people. As well as the traditional owners of the land of which you're joining us from on Zoom as we are live streaming across the country tonight. I pay my respects to elders past, present. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Just some housekeeping. The bathrooms, usually they're out the back, but I won't make you trudge through the rain and in the dark. So you're welcome to use the ones inside the shop tonight. They're just behind the counter and upstairs. Towards the end of the event tonight, we'll have some time for questions. So if you do have one, just save it for the end. And for those of you on Zoom, if you do have a question, just type it into the chat box and then those will be passed along to me. And then afterwards, we will move inside. If you haven't purchased your copy of the book already, they're available at the front counter. And we'll move inside afterwards where you can mingle some more. The bar will be open. You can get your book signed as well. And finally, if you could just take a moment to pop your phones on silent, that would be greatly appreciated. Now, I'd like to introduce you. There are a couple of spots right at the front here. Right. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Tim Mavin, who will be in conversation with Darryl tonight. Dr. Tim Mavin is an associate professor in the School of Education and Professional Studies at Griffith University and a wing commander at the Royal Australian Air Force Reserves. He worked as a professional pilot and simulator instructor for 25 years and has flown with 4 airlines in Australia and overseas. Tim has over 10,000 hours flying experience and was a flight operations inspector for the Civil Aviation Safety Authority. As an academic, Tim has consulted with almost every major airline within the Tasman region. He's also worked with Defence in Pilot Training and the Defence Science and Technology Group, researching and developing ab initio pilot training. If you could please put your hands together in a warm welcome.
Thank you very much. I'll kick it off actually. I've actually been involved in a couple of books myself over the last couple of years. One was an edited version of a educational book where we actually were the editors, we had people write books. Another book that I wrote probably about 5 years ago, looking at training and education of air traffic control pilots, cabin crew and engineers around the world in the current training settings. One thing I learned from that is that there's a huge effort that goes into writing a book, and I actually wrote this one with 3 other colleagues. So first off, it's an absolute privilege to be here tonight. I know how much work goes into a book. One that's research-based is huge. You can't actually make it up. You know what I mean? You can't. You'll often make your own story. What I really want to know tonight is probably tell us about the man who, still at the age of 12, who only a couple of years later was awarded an MBE by the King of England, King George V. And also, his wife Muriel said, "You don't actually know the worth of a person, but the Allied forces air superiority over Europe would have been less if it wasn't for Harry." Tell us about the man.
Well, that's a good introduction to a very complex person. Having left school at age 12, and then suddenly, not only do they discover that he's a brilliant pilot, but also a brilliant aircraft designer. And so I was interested in the man himself, not only as a great pilot and designer, but interested in this complex person that was so able to make such a contribution to World War I. You might say that World War I came along very, very nicely for him, very appropriately for him, but that's really where he was able to shine.
So, what were the strengths that he had? That's the thing that interests me. How can someone leave school here and basically 12 years of age, what were the strengths that he brought with him to become one of the greatest aircraft designers in World War One?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that he was very ambitious, not so much in a sort of personal sense, but he really wanted to. He was teenager. He was building his own motorbikes. He was Victorian-born, and he built his own motorbikes. And then he got work in rural Victoria as a chauffeur mechanic for rich graziers. And one of the things that his role there was to drive some of these rich graziers between their polo events and things like that. But one of his mates was talking about him and said, you know, not only was he great with he was always trying to get his cars to go, but he said they used to roads and get their owners, you know, in their employers' cars, and so he always has this sort of drive. And when he got in, he discovered aviation. He saw Harry Houdini, the famous escape artist. Harry Houdini made what was probably the first powered flight in Australia. And when he saw Harry Houdini, he knew where his future lay. And from that time on, Harry Hawker just pursued aviation, and when he first went to England, he got his pilot's license in double quick time, and straight away he was creating records. Within a few weeks, he was flying solo. He became an instructor in his own right. And there was a sort of this immediate genius showed through, and his fellow pilots recognised that. And he had this throughout his life. He had this persistence that he wanted to do more, and you know, go where no person had ever gone before. And that sometimes was a bit of a struggle for his wife, but nevertheless, that was sort of what drove him always. He was always looking for new pursuits, new ways to go faster, higher, and for longer.
So you mentioned Muriel, his wife. How did she fit in the early years, and what do you think was the main strength of the partnership that they had? Because the book is not just about Harry; it's about the partnership of both Harry and Muriel before and after his passing.
I was very keen to show Muriel's part in this, because often books look like this about aviators or anybody else who sort of stands out, any men who stand out in a crowd, you know, who are, you know, drive faster and create records and those sorts of things. Their family is lost in the story. And I've tried to include his wife in this because I think she played a really particular part in this story. His actual meeting of her is just one of those boy meets girl stories where she was driving in a London park, and she was anyway. She was only 18 and she had her own car, which was pretty amazing back in 1915 when he met her. And she was driving her own car around in this London park, and it broke down. And she couldn't work out what was wrong with it. And then this car came along beside, you know, and this guy jumps out, he and his mate, and it's Harry Hawker. And he says, "Oh, can I help you?" And she says, "No, thank you very much. But, you know, I don't like the look of you." And she's English, and because she recognises straight away his Australian accent. And she says, "You know, I don't know about you, mate. No, thanks very much. We're good." So off they go. And then she discovers, in fact, that the petrol that she bought that morning in a can, as you did in those days, was not in fact petrol but water. The guy had sold her a can of water, so she had water in the petrol, and so they stopped a couple of cars. She actually drained the tank. She was a pretty resourceful woman. This 80 years old. She knew how to drain the tank. She drains the tank, and they wait for somebody else to come past. A couple of cars come along, but they've got no extra petrol. Oh, and then guess who comes around again? Oh, it's Harry. Harry and his mate just happened to be driving by again. And Harry says, "Oh, I know what the problem was. It was your petrol, wasn't it?" And she says, "How did you know that?" And he says, "Oh, you know, and any girl should look in the petrol tank first, because that's where your problem always lies." But anyway, that at that point, after he happened to have some petrol in his can of petrol, so he he's got her car going with his petrol, and then they exchanged phone numbers, and off he drove, and she thought she'd never see him again. And then a week later, she got this phone call. They said at her house, and they said, "Oh, the police are on the line for you." And she said, "Oh, it's me." She said, "What have I done?" And she gets on the phone. She goes, "Hello," and then this other person starts talking. She says, "This sounds very much like that Australian accent that I heard." And sure enough, it's Harry pretending to be a policeman because he was a bit worried. He was a bit worried that her parents might let him talk unless he had some. So and Muriel became like she also didn't mind driving pretty fast around the road. She was talking about old crotches on the road that they used to burn off, and she liked to drive like that as well. But she gave him a sort of stability, if you like, in his life. When he was trying to do all these wonderful things and be faster and higher and longer, she had the sort of stability in his life that he needed. I think that's the way I've read this, and that's why I've put her much more into the story than you would get in most books about heroic pilots or racing car drivers.
Yeah, and I think that from my perspective as a pilot, the greatness of Harry Wifey, I didn't even actually realise I knew the name, but only the name through the aircraft that he tested in World War I, such as the Australian Sopwith Camel, which we used in World War I, and the Hawker Hunter, which was used in many of the air forces and still used today, one of the jets that they use. So quite a famous person. I didn't actually know his history at all. But going back to Muriel as well, who was with him from the age of 18 and married, they had kids. At the cessation of World War I, they started to expand the aviation industry. And there was a poignant moment, I think, when Harry was leaving to actually start the Atlantic Challenge, where he, for the first time, realised that he might not be coming home. So from that point, it was an interesting story that we had Muriel, who was sitting back in England waiting for the news, and Harry on the other side of the Atlantic trying to get across for the first time. So can you tell us about the stories of both Muriel and what it was like to be waiting for the news for Harry to make the actual huge flight across the Atlantic, and what it was like for Harry to actually challenge the Americans, the French, in that race?
Well, I think that's one of the interesting things, that Harry wanted to be the first to fly the Atlantic. This was immediately after World War I, and Harry wanted to be the first. There was a challenge out to actually get £10,000 prize being offered by one of the English newspapers, and Harry wanted to be the first. Sopwith Aviation, whom he worked for, would sponsor him on flight. The best way to fly from that side of the world across because of the winds, they got wind assistance coming, and flying the other way, you're flying against the wind, and you could well run out of petrol on the way. So the good money said, go to Newfoundland and fly between countries. And in those days, we didn't have the internet, mobile phones, or cables just started to come in that the newspapers tended to use. But people didn't have everyday communication. So when Harry went off, finally with Muriel's blessing, and he asked her whether he should go, because they had one child at this time, and he asked her whether she should go. If I say no, when somebody else becomes the first person to fly across, he'll remember what I said. And if I say yes, well, I could lose my husband, because this is a pretty drastic flight. It was close to 2,000 miles across the Atlantic that he'd be flying in a pretty basic aircraft. So when he went to Newfoundland, he said, I'll only be 2 weeks and then I'll be taking off. But the trouble is the weather closed in Newfoundland, and they couldn't take off. And if they couldn't, even when the weather cleared on that side of the globe, the weather across the Atlantic was desperate. in fact, we actually arranged this weather tonight to give you some idea of what flying through a storm might be like. And of course, they didn't have the Bureau of Meteorology in those days. They had pretty rudimentary reporting of the weather from ships and shore stations. And so nobody was quite sure what the weather was like. And so she had no communication with Harry all the time. And he ended up being away for almost 8 weeks. And she had no communication with him except through the newspaper. She used to have to read the papers to find out what was happening to her husband in Newfoundland. So, you know, you can imagine the anxiety. You know, this is a young mother. She was in her early 20s. With a small baby. The baby was only born in October and he was over there in March, so it was only 6 months old. And so the strain on her must have been enormous.
Yeah, and this is really important because basically if you think about the ingenuity of Harry, if anything, like as a pilot, I've actually ferried aeroplanes across the Pacific before, out of New Zealand into Oklahoma. And there's a lot of water there, you know what I mean? And it's actually, you realise when you go down, there's not a lot of people are going to come out very quickly and rescue you. But if you can talk a little bit about probably the last couple of hours of the flight before they went down, because I actually was quite intrigued with not only the resourcefulness as a pilot, but as an engineer to think about what actually may happen in addition. I found that fascinating.
The problem was this: Harry and he had a navigator with him, Mackenzie Grieve, and because that was part of the requirement, you have to have a pilot and a navigator to make this flight under the terms of the prize. And they when they set off, they actually set off because an American team had set off earlier, and they were determined to beat the Americans across. And the weather wasn't as great as it might have been for them. They'd been holding off. And finally, they took off, and then the flight seemed to be going all right. Harry, as a designer, had these pretty interesting little designs, little additions, like he dropped the undercarriage off, for example, after they'd taken off. He pulled a lever and the undercarriage dropped off because they thought that was too much drag, and they'd scooped the underside of the plane so that when they came into land, they were just basically going to slide across the tarmac. That was the intention. But after some considerable number of hours in the air, the temperature started to rise on the engine, and they were watching this needle going up. And Harry thought there was some rubbish probably in the radiator, and he reckoned the way to get out of that, and he's done this before, was you made a steep dive, and that pushed the rubbish into another part of the radiator and cleared the filter. So he yells out to his mate, his navigator, "I'm going down," and then he just takes a dive down, and yeah, sure enough, it did clear a little bit, and so he maintains his track again, and then they're still watching, and the temperature starts to rise again. He says, "I'm going to have to do this again." So off he goes. He says he yells to his mate, and go down again. And this is in dark cloud, right, by this time. And he's no idea where the ocean is below him. And so he dives down, and suddenly he comes out and there's the ocean immediately below him, just a few hundred feet below him. And so he's turned the engine off at this point because he didn't want it pumping water through. And he's turned the engine off. He flicks the switch to turn the engine back on again. Nothing happens. And they're heading towards the water at a great pace. He tries to level it out, and he manages to level it out a bit, but he's pretty sure they're going to crash. And he yells out to Mackenzie Grieve, "Quick, start pumping the petrol. We need some more fuel." And so Mackenzie Grieve leans forward, and he's got this manual pump, and he's pumping petrol furiously, and they're 100 feet from the surface of the Atlantic Ocean in the middle of nowhere. And next minute, the engines fire, and Harry pulls back on the stick, and they zoom up above about 100 feet above the surface of the ocean, and manage to escape on that occasion. But regrettably, the temperature continues to rise, so they have to take more drastic action.
Yeah, yeah, that was actually the fascinating part of it, because as you have written, was that the actual back part of the fuselage was designed by Harry to be a boat. I actually thought that that would take him like a small thing from like a raft from the Titanic or something. I wasn't quite sure what it was, but the actual aircraft design that pitched the actual boat would be the top part of the fuselage, and that's when the crew picked them up.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's one of the amazing things about Harry and his design abilities. He actually had this little craft that they said it looked like a Dutch shoe that clamped upside down as part of the fuselage behind the cockpit. And so when they actually landed on the water, as they had to, they undid these clips, if you like, and flipped this boat over. And were able to ride it out until they were finally rescued by a passing ship. This is in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean.
In dark, my gosh, yeah. Okay, I found that fascinating, but the part of the story that really is important, I think, to be told, and to be quite frank, the parallel with Apollo 13 is there for me, because on the other side of the world, Harry was supposed to have landed about 5 hours before, and the whole nation was basically on tenterhooks, and that's the parallel I brought. So, tell me about, like, from Muriel's perspective.
Well, once again, here was Muriel. What Muriel had done was Harry reckoned he could do this flight across the Atlantic in 19 and a half hours. Muriel was allowing him 22 because she knew that's how much fuel was in the tank. And she actually had a writing pad, and she wrote the hours down, 1, 2, 3, up to 22. And as the hours passed, she knew that he had taken off. That's the information came through, that he had taken off. So she knew that he had taken off from Newfoundland. But there was no other information. They had no radio, and so they knew nothing about them. So she just kept crossing off the hours. And as it narrowed down, she said, well, you know, we're getting close to Harry's 19 and a half. We'll go over to the airfield and wait for him there. And of course, she wasn't the only one. I mean, there were people from the air ministry, etc., who were there. And so she was there waiting, crossing off the hours. 19, she crossed off, 20, 21, they're looking out in the sky, 22, the end of her hours that she'd actually noted down. And the after 24 hours, they said, they must have run out of fuel. We don't know where they are, or we don't know what happened to them. And she had to go home and just wait and see what was going to happen. But there was no news. Nobody had sighted them. Nobody had seen them since they'd taken off over Newfoundland.
But the story doesn't finish there, does it? Only Harry could escape this one. And I actually thought that would have been the end of the story. Actually, I thought, oh, I've got a fair way to go. Yeah, I thought he was gone, so it must be all that Muriel. But I was surprised when that is. There's a little bit of, like, I know that Muriel actually received a letter from the king as well. But up until that point, everyone was quite sad. Everyone was thinking about it. There was lots of grieving. But that, I think it was a freighter that launched itself up onto the coast of England. Tell us about that, because I remember sitting there thinking, "Wow, that was so interesting."
Yeah, well, and just to mention about the king, there was worldwide interest in this flight. This was the first, and Harry Hawker was really well known at the time. This is 1919. Immediately after the war, people were looking for good news stories. Here's Harry Hawker flying across the Atlantic. You know, this is fantastic stuff. And then Harry disappears. Nobody knows where he is. So all the newspapers across the land, across Australia and in Britain, where he was living, were full of the news about Harry Hawker, or full of the news about Harry Hawker's disappearance. And finally, the king, after 6 days, the King George V, sent Muriel a telegram and said, "My condolences on the death of your husband." And our own poet, Banjo Patterson, wrote a eulogy, a eulogy for Harry Hawker, which was published in Smith's Weekly, I think it was, and so everybody gave him away. Everybody said, there's no chance now. If he had been picked up by a ship, surely the captain would have radioed in by now and said, we've got Harry on board, but nobody did. So, and then of course, it's a bit like, today conspiracy theories arise. Oh, we know where he is. He flew too far. He's crashed in the Highlands of Scotland, and we can't find him up there. And no, he's somewhere else here. And there were all sorts of false hopes, given, but nobody had actually sighted him or his plane. And then. There's a couple of Coast Guard people up on the far northwest of Scotland, and they're sitting there one day, just minding their own business and hoping that nobody needs rescuing, but they shouldn't, because it was a really calm day. Nobody need rescuing today, surely. And then they hear this ship's whistle. They go, "Oh, what's that?" So they go outside, these two guys, and they see this ship come in, and it comes in quite close, and it starts to raise flags. So in those days, of course, everybody knew what flags meant, so they could read the flags. And so they're watching these flags go up, and it says, "Have survivors on board." And they go, "Oh, what survivors could they be? Where are they from?" And then they put up another flag, and it starts off SOP, and they go, "Oh, what?" And then they go, surely that means Sopwith. And then the guy, the captain of the ship, who's Danish and is heading towards Denmark, he says, "Well, I've had enough. I've told them now. I've got these survivors on board. They're from the Sopwith, and now I've got to get back to Denmark, and I've got my wife's waiting for me over there, and I've got this load to deliver." So off he starts to chalk, and these guys on the shore go, hang on," and they quickly put up their flags, and they go, "Is it Hawker?" And then the ship turns back, and flags go up, and it goes, YES, comes up from the flagpole, and so immediately the message gets transmitted through, and of course in typical style, it's not the Admiralty that tells Muriel that her husband is alive. It's the Daily Express rings her up, and this is the editor of the Daily Express. I've got some great news for you, and I'd like an exclusive interview afterwards. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. We're probably not going to we're not going to ruin the ending, I don't think, but one of the things that really is, like, you made this up, I know you did, because when Harry and Bree were actually brought into the parade, was it about 100 Australian soldiers who happened to be there? And they were trying, is that actually true? I'd love to hear more about that, because I found that quite amazing. Like in London, we have all these Australian soldiers.
This was actually, absolutely brilliant from an Australian point of view. What they did was that the Royal Navy had been under barrage for not going out and looking for Harry, and so when they heard that he was on this Danish ship that was now chuffing off back to Denmark, they sent out a destroyer and said, "Hang on, we're coming to pick Harry up." And so that's what they did. And they took him back to Scotland, and they put him on a train the next day, and he and Mackenzie Greaves, his navigator, and to send him back to London. And on all the way on the trip, there were people out on every platform cheering and waving, playing bagpipes, of course, in Scotland, throwing flowers into the carriage as they went. And when they reached London, there were 20,000 people there waiting to greet them. But the amazing thing was, this was just after World War I. And there were thousands, in fact, not just 100. 100 were the ones that were active, but there were thousands of Australian soldiers still in England, because they couldn't get enough shipping to bring them back to Australia after the war. And so they were all on leave. and that there was an official reception for Harry at the railway station, and while they were sort of assembling that, this big contingent of Australian soldiers marched up, and they said they were just, people were going, what are these guys here for? And they said, oh, we're just Australians on leave, don't worry about us. But when Harry actually arrived, and Muriel tells the story because she was actually with him. She met him on the trip down and travelled down the train with him on the second half. And Muriel tells the story. She said Australian soldiers burst into their carriage and pulled Harry out, took him outside, put him in his own car, which they brought from his home, which was a homemade one that he made, which was a big super big car that he made, and they put him in the car, lifted the car up. This is the soldiers lifted it up, and so they marched through the crowd. There's 20,000 people there, and there's photos of it from the newspapers at the time, and here they are marching through the crowd with this car lifted up above their heads. And it's just amazing, and you can see the slouch hats of the Australians in the crowd. So there's a real Australian connection here all the time. You know, they saw Harry as an Aussie. He lived in England for quite a long while at this point, but nevertheless they saw him as an Aussie. It was just amazing the scenes that they had, and the other troops, the other Australian troops, also. Provided a sort of guard through the city to try and keep him safe and keep people from being trampled as they moved through. And the Times, the Times next day said the Australian troops did a wonderful job. They said, perhaps not orthodox in an orthodox way, but nevertheless they did a great job of keeping people safe in these circumstances.
Last question. What's his legacy?
Well, I think it's an interesting legacy. I mean, one of the things that you still have the Hawker name carried on. He died relatively young, but the Hawker name carried on in the companies that continued on with his name on it. And even that in itself is an interesting story because he actually was working with Sopwith Aviation. But at the end of the war, the English government, the British government, introduced a new tax on profits made during the war. And the Sopwith Aviation Company had done very well, thank you very much, during the war building planes. And so they were up for a pretty big sum of this it was a retro tax for wartime profits. And so what did they do? Well, they just closed the company down. Sopwith Aviation no longer exists. Oh, we've started another company. It's called H.G. Hawker Engineering. And Tommy Sopwith, who was the CEO, he said, we just didn't want people to get confused about the name, so we just changed them, He didn't mention the fact that they were actually no longer liable for tax. But the Hawker name continued on as a result of that. Even though Harry died, the Hawker name continued on, and as you were saying, some of the most famous planes, even up to World War II, were Hawker hunters and and various Hawkers continued on. So and Harry, I suppose Harry, you asked me about Harry's personal legacy. I mean, one of the things was there's just sort of this persistence, like he would never give up. He was just one of those people that, okay, if I can't fly the Atlantic, surely I can do something else. I can drive racing cars. Somebody offered him, an opportunity to drive a racing car. Yes, I can do that. So then he was invited to drive speedboats in an international competition. Yes, I can do that. So he took on all these challenges, and I think that's. It's interesting to see how somebody can sort of be driven in the way that he was.
Yeah, exactly. You did gloss over when, right at the end when the war had finished, when Sopwith Aviation went into making saucepans. And Harry, who was obviously the leading test pilot in World War I, walked up and said, "Saucepans, where do I fit in?" So I think that I'm certainly getting to the point where I don't want to go to I don't want to go any further and talk about the death of Harry. I think that's that's probably my thinking at this point in time. But you know, when you try to weave a story with two people, Muriel and it's quite poignant because, like, if I'd have read this book, you know, 2019 with World War One, you know, given what's going on right now, it becomes a bit more personal with what's going on. So I think it's a great read, wonderful read, Darryl. You pulled it together nicely. There's some great aviation tales there that probably would bore everyone except for probably a couple of pilots and myself, some of the things that I've seen. I suspect that I'm alive today because of that man. Learning to do a spin recovery was actually Harry. He actually learned how to recover from a spin. And only 2 years ago, I was strapped into one of the PC-21s, which is the new aircraft for the Royal Australian Air Force, spinning. Right. And when you think about that, you think that was the man. That was the man who actually survived, because many did, unfortunately.
Okay, well, thank you.
We'll have some time for questions. Would someone like to kick us off? Bit shy tonight, everyone. I'll kick it off. Why Harry? What led you to Harry?
Well, I think it's an interesting question, and actually was kicked off by an earlier book of mine on Bert Hinkler, another pioneer aviator. And it was while I was doing research on Bert Hinkler, which the book's called Hustling Hinkler, which was published a few years ago, that I came across Harry Hawker. And like you, I'd never actually heard of Harry Hawker. And then, so as I started to read about him, I thought, you know, here's another interesting person, and the title that I finally settled on for the book, A Great and Restless Spirit, seemed to me to sum up that sort of restlessness. He was always driven. He was always trying to do more. He was never satisfied with what he was doing. So I was interested in Harry as a man, not only in what he achieved, but just Harry as a person who was driven in this way. So I tried to document the way that this continued throughout his life. And of course, as we've said, you know, this had implications for his family as well. So it wasn't just him out there by himself, but any of these things, and you know, his wife sort of prevaricated, I think, at times. She encouraged him to do things, but she also became concerned about how what she later called his precarious activities. So it was it's the complexity of the person. I'm interested in people as human beings, you know, and the way that they live their lives and cope with these challenges, and then try and fit this in with being a husband and a father.
And I like that you do spend some of the book talking about Muriel's perspective. I think a lot of the times, particularly with autobiographies, they are solely focused on the one perspective. And you talked about how she grapples with his restless spirit. How did you go about finding her perspective on things? Were they diary entries you found? Was it through media pieces? What was the research like there into Muriel?
Well, fortunately, as a researcher, after his death, she actually wrote a book about her husband. And so this is where she told some of the stories about her life with Harry, including, by the way, the fact that he was a very poor reader, and she used to read books to him because she said she couldn't stand seeing him plodding his way through books. You know, here's a guy who was a world-class pilot and designer, but he struggled through books, and she said Dracula was his favourite book.
Darryl, you see any parallels here? See any parallels between Harry and Bert Hinkler, and did they know each other?
It's a really interesting question. They both had a restless spirit, but they followed very different paths. But Bert Hinkler was always the battler. Bert Hinkler never had any money. And he was always trying to put off paying people, and when he didn't so much want to be a long distance flyer in that sense. He wanted to fly. He wanted to fly long distances, but not across water like the transatlantic flight. He wanted to be the first to fly to Australia, for example, which he did as a solo pilot. But he was always, he had to pay the Air Ministry in England to send telegrams ahead, say, you know, I will be at such and such a place and such a time, and can you arrange petrol and things like that. So, and then the Air Ministry would bill him for it. And then so he'd then try to talk them out of any charges for it. Harry Horger was, because he was employed by Sopwith, he actually did quite well as a paid employee of Sopwith, and even when he was doing his famous looping the loop, and you know, he used to do these multiple roles. He used to get paid for that on a daily basis. If he did some roles, he'd be paid for that at the time, and he was really paid quite well, and he actually did quite well for himself. And I can't remember the exact amount that he left, but it was something like the equivalent of £250,000 in today's money that he left. Whereas poor old Bert always struggled with that. But nevertheless, I think the thing that does join them is that sort of restlessness. You know, that they were never satisfied with what they were doing. They always wanted to push the boundaries.
Did they know each other?
Only marginally. It's interesting that there's no mention of that. I think that Muriel mentions him once in the book, in her book, and says, you know, Hinkler, and she spells his name wrong. You know, Bert Hinkler was also in this race or something like that, you know. So there were some races in Britain that they were both in, but it doesn't look like they had any close connection.
Darryl, what was the most difficult part to write?
The most difficult part of the book was the first chapter.
That's a nice book.
No, I think the most difficult part was I grappled for a long time with what to do with the story of him trying to fly across the Atlantic, about how much detail to put into that, because it's a case of I ended up making the decision that I would make it as if I would tell the story like as if people were following his story through at the time. So I kept it, you know, in the book itself. I don't say whether he was saved or not up front. I ended up putting that story finally, you know, when Muriel finally heard about it and the Coast Guard got the message. I put that quite, you know, towards the end, so that to build some tension, and then the detail actually about how he was picked up, and then I ended up putting it as a postscript rather than being in the story, because I thought it actually held the story up in a sense. You know, it was interesting detail, I thought, but in the end I put it at the end rather than in the middle of the story, because I wanted the narrative to flow.
How long did it take you from loading up?
At least 5 years, Terry. It took me at least five years, I think, to actually write the book. And I went through a few iterations in the meantime. I actually wrote it in present tense at one stage, and then changed it back to past tense, which was an interesting exercise. Doing a global change doesn't work in that, I have to tell you, because the word, I changed the word May to might, for example, and then of course the 31st of May became the 31st of might. So I had to prove it very carefully.
Did he ever come back to Australia?
He did come back to Australia, but quite early on. In fact, before the war, even before he met Muriel, he came back here in 1914. He got employment in England when he went over in 1912. And then in 1914, he came back here, and he came back by ship, but he brought a plane with him. They were trying to sell a plane, one of his that he designed, to the Australian government. At that stage, our Air Force consisted of 3 planes, and when he went down to Point Cook at the invitation of the Air Minister, when they got there, one of the planes had crashed, and so we were down to 2 planes. and at that stage, the Australian government wasn't really ready for it. They actually thought the plane that he bought with him was too advanced for the Australian Air Force at that stage. Of course, within 6 months we were at war, and their attitude changed, and they had to develop some planes and an aviation capability.
follow-up question. Is he more famous in England or more famous in Australia? I mean, I never heard of him. So is he he's not famous in Australia, you don't think?
He was famous in Australia at the time, and as he was in England, he was probably just as famous in Australia. You know, and when I'm doing research, I find, you know, like there's little country newspapers with little items that, you know, I find about it. You know, and, you know, the Bendigo Times has got got a little paragraph about Harry Hawker. You know, we'll leave. You know, we'll take off from Newfoundland next week. Things like that. So there were these little stories peppered all over us, the Australian papers, but you know, and some of the bigger ones, like the Sydney Morning Herald, actually had a story about how he'd been found when he disappeared. They had a story in there about how he'd been found, which was not true.
You mentioned that they're up against the American team when they were going for the crossing. Do you know who they were?
Yeah, we know a lot about the American team because the Americans actually had a different scenario. They were leaving from Newfoundland, but they were flying flying boats, seaplanes, and that they were going to do this in two steps. They were flying to the islands known as the Azores, which are in you know, a bit further south than where Harry was going on his direct route, and then they were going to fly to Portugal from there. And so they had three planes, these big planes that they developed during the war, in fact, that they were hoping to fly to Europe for the war. But when they didn't need them for the war, they said, hey, we still want to fly the Atlantic. And so they had these planes prepared. And Harry and the other British teams that were in Newfoundland kept looking over their shoulder and going, what are the Yanks up to? And then finally the Yanks arrived in Newfoundland and in another base, and just down you know, a few 100 kilometres away, but they prepared to take off from there. And so, but the other thing that the Americans had was a string of warships, which they placed across the Atlantic, that were going to guide these planes across. Well, the British, there was a lot of tut-tutting in the British press about this. You know, in fact, one of the British competitors said, you know, you may as well just fly the Channel 50 times because that's what it's like. You're just going to go, you know, you're going between ships. There's no risk involved in this. As it turned out, there was considerable risk, and two of the planes came down and couldn't get up again, and finally one of them did get through, but it was true that when Harry heard that the Americans had taken off, that triggered his takeoff, and some regarded that as premature, but it was Muriel who said, as soon as I knew the Americans had taken off, I knew Harry would, because national honour was at stake, British honour, of course.
Any other questions? I do have one more. I wanted to know, what do you think you've brought to Harry's story that you think other accounts of his story didn't have?
I think I've probably said a little bit about this earlier, and that I think is Muriel's perspective much more strongly. There's one previous significant, you know, one previous book some 30 or so years ago, but it's a more technical sort of account, and Muriel doesn't get much of a Guernsey in that, and so I was quite keen to sort of show this interaction between Harry and Muriel. And the other thing is, of course, you know, with the internet these days, you can find a lot more information, really. I was able to tap into some of the American newspapers and see what they were saying about Harry, for example, and saying about their own people flying. And you know, so there's little excerpts that I was able to just add more detail. And I think I've sort of, you know, like more colour to the book, I think, in that way. And so I've tried to humanise Harry, you know, without, you know, and rather than romanticise him. And I think that's, you know, I hope I've succeeded in doing that.
It certainly sounds like you've done his story justice, and I can hear the passion you have for storytelling as well. Tim, do you have any wrapping up words?
That's good.
This has been fantastic. If everyone could put their hands together.
Thank you to everybody for coming. I'm very grateful to all family and friends from all sorts of places that have been here, including some of my good mates from Oxley Men's Shed, and thank you, men. Some chalky friends here from my army teaching time, and then friends from I see the Sherwood Corinda, Chelmer is well represented, and then members of my own family from across Brisbane, and also my daughter who has flown up from Tasmania just for the occasion, so I'm very. And I'm fairly confident there are some good friends who've been streaming this as well, including probably Barry and Jean in Armidale, and also from Armidale, I see Jeff and Judy. They're our good friends from Armidale, and they've also come up for the occasion. So thank you for making the trip. Those other people streaming, I haven't seen the list of people who are streaming, so I'm grateful to you for taking this message tonight and listening to it. So and thank you. I know Bronwyn's watching in Sydney, I know, and I think Weymouth in Coffs Harbour. So thank you to all my friends around Australia, and thank you for your support here tonight. Such a good bookshop, and like somebody who will remain unnamed was sniffing the books tonight. But I said I can understand why you sniff the book. It's got that smell of a real bookshop about it. You can't get that online.
Thanks, Darryl. As I said, we've got copies of the book inside at the counter, and Darryl will be inside where he can sign your book as well. The bar will be open, so feel free to grab a drink and mingle. So yeah, that's all for us.
Everyone doesn't want to be in a photo, please. Good to see everyone. I'm not aware of the family. Come on, can't fit you all in. Let's do better.
Landscape.
Sit in the front with a big glass of wine. Good on you, dear.
Can you fit us in?
Wow, that's a bit of paragraph. Incredible.
Say Harry.
Harry. You'll have to do some clever editing there.